Hello and welcome to session 246 in the AI Safety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the last part of the article, Democratizing AI in search of a, sorry, I said the name wrong, Democratizing Risk in search of a methodology to study existential risk. This is still work done by Carlos Primo from FHI and Luke Kemp from CSER. And we'll be discussing from section 5 and onwards, since we have covered the last. And we will also be going over parts of the comments and an EA forum post accompanying this paper. But first, I want to take, before we actually get to step 5, I want to take a quick step back to the definitions, because there is, in fact, even though the definition are in section 4, there is in fact something in section 5 about definitions that I think is important to highlight, and that is on when we are judging a moratorium on AI and how hard that would be to coordinate. Then it's not enough to look at this in isolation and say, yes, this seems hard, but we need to compare it to our other options, and building an aligned AI, that also seems really hard. And there are a number of reasons why we should expect that to be very hard, and perhaps look at the moratoriums in a more favorable look based on that. The first is that aligned AI needs to have a really high level of reliability. And depending on precisely how big you view the risk from unaligned AI, then if you view it as very small, then it needs to be really aligned. If you view it as we are by default doomed, then it would be nice if it's reliable, but halfway reliable is better than being doomed. Another reason why AI aligned is expected to be hard is that it's basically non-existing technology, and that's in general really hard, and there's no way around that. Some way it has been done. It doesn't look obviously impossible. We certainly haven't found any impossibility results, but it's clear that there is a lot of work to be done. It's something that is probably decades away. At least AGI, in my view, is probably a decade away, and the deadline for aligned AI will probably obviously coincide with when will we have AGI. The authors are arguing that it requires a refined vision of the future in order to align AI. And I think it certainly obviously it requires a vision of the future, but it's not necessarily that refined, at least as I see it. There are not that many details about the future that need to come to pass before AI alignment is valuable. One of the things where a refined vision of the future is important is that the authors claim that we will need precise control of the speeds of technologies if we want to do the differential technological development thing. And we don't actually need precise control, as far as I can see. We need one brake and one accelerator, and AGI development needs to hit the brake, and AI alignment needs to hit the accelerator. And if we overshoot from that, then that's perfectly fine if we have aligned AI ready too soon. So there is no real requirement for precise control. It's a technology that's interlinked with other technologies. I presume that they mean AGI, and that is indeed true, and requires fine-tuned regulatory tools, and these need to be implemented worldwide. Possibly, plausibly, it depends on what the alignment tax is. There are also some pivotal acts that might make this less required. But I think overall the idea stands that you can't say that just a moratorium is hard, period. You need to argue that moratoriums are harder than aligned AI. So that was actually something in section 5 that I think belonged in section 4. So let's actually go to the main topic for today, the risks of studying existential risk. So there are some trivial low-level problems, like we won't actually solve the problem, and we will waste resources by going down wrong paths. And that's not really what they're talking about here. Though those exist, obviously everybody agrees. Here's a key quote. The zealous pursuit of technological development, according to proponents of the techno-utopian approach, accounts for the vast majority of risks over the coming centuries. So this sentence, like many others in this paper, is ambiguous because it can be read in two ways. That according to the proponents of the techno-utopian approach, this accounts for the vast majority of risks, which is totally true. Or it can also be read as that the pursuit of technological development is according to the proponents of the techno-utopian approach. And this is something that is implied many times, that it's kind of like this. Of course, the authors can't really come out directly and say Bostrom wants to build a super intelligence, because he makes it reasonably clear that he really doesn't want that. But that is insinuated many times. It's argued that technological maturity is the only way to permanently end existential risk by people from using the techno-utopian approach. I think this might not be true. There is the long reflection as an example of something that permanently ends existential risk, but does not imply technological maturity. It might imply it, but it's certainly possible that we can have the long reflection without phase chronization or something like that. And the authors further say it's unclear why we can't just make technology that stops existential risk without also having dangerous AGI and bioweapons and all these other things. And I think it is indeed possible to do this. It might be possible to develop the technology to address these things, but the problem is that it's not so much that we want technology to stop supervolcanoes, because supervolcanoes actually isn't the real problem. The real problem is how do we stop other people from making dangerous inventions. And that's the key thing. So I think what the authors managed to argue here isn't really strongly, at least at this point, that the techno-utopian, that the current approach to existential risk studies really makes the risk greater, except for the obvious case that if you think it's a bad approach, then it overshadows other approaches that could do existential risk studies better. Next is on the STOMP reflex, which is defined as the long history of security threats being used to enable draconian emergency powers, which are subsequently abused. So the name, the STOMP reflex, has been coined by the author Luke Kemp in a previous article. I am a bit confused about this. It seems like the STOMP reflex doesn't really explain very much about what this is, and I also don't really think this is original. I think it's something that many other people have noted before. And this STOMP reflex argues further that the greater the threat, the more extreme the measures, and particularly for human extinctions, then the measures could be very extreme. And the thing we're seeing right now with AI is very much not draconian emergency powers. I think what we're seeing is possibly the opposite, in that most people and the authorities might seem like they're totally unaware, really. I think it's worthwhile to be aware that this could change in the future, but it's certainly not something that is here right now. They give one example that the power to start the Third World War is in the hands of Joe Biden and Putin right now. So it's not under any kind of democratic control. It seems kind of, when I read the authors, like this was just a bad, stupid thing that was that just happened to be. I think there are actually very good reasons why this might be the most stable way to do it. But I agree that the precedent it is creating is quite worrying, because it would be easy to say, just like the president has the right to fire the nuclear missiles, the president also has the right to decide whether they should pursue a national security AGI crash Manhattan project. Securitization. That is a way to change the discussion about an issue from like normal politics to national security. You could almost say that this is taking it out of politics. And in this case, it's often delegated to military and intelligence officials. And there are different approaches to securitization, to moving things away from politics and into the realm of national security. And unfortunately, the only approach that is being discussed is the techno-utopian approach. And I would really like to know, like, if there are many others, then what are they? And also, to me, this seems like a really bad thing to happen. And I'm not so much interested in hearing the best way to do this, rather than how can we avoid securitization, which the authors don't discuss, unfortunately. Rather, they argue that the techno-utopian approach is particularly vulnerable to authoritarian securitization. I think when you try to unpack this, this seems very problematic. Like, there is, I can imagine another really easy way to securitize a subject, which is to say that this is very dangerous and this will kill you. Like, you can do that with nuclear weapons. You can say the president needs to have the authority because that's the only stable way, and if there is a third world war, you personally will die. And that's like a very fear-based, intuitive system. And there are in general in securitization, this is the way people argue that the other countries will get a strategic advantage and this kind of thing. And that is my understanding of how securitization is normally done. But I am not an expert, and the paper doesn't really say how it's otherwise done. But the techno-utopian approach, recall that this is basically the argument that the universe has a potential cornucopia, that in theory it would be possible to have 10 to the 54th humans if we colonize the entire universe and put as many digital people in there, happy digital people, as possible. And I think that, to me, sounds like a really poor object for securitization. In that, like, you could imagine that the president comes on the TV and in grave tones say that we need to do this because otherwise we will die. And I couldn't see him go and argue that this needs to be taken out of politics because otherwise we can't realize 10 to the 54th people. That seems to me like an unlikely approach for securitization. Now we turn to Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis, where it is stated in this article that Bostrom's preferred solution is extreme preventative policing and widespread surveillance through freedom tags. And if we we read this article quite a while ago, actually, in the reading group, where Bostrom has the following quote: "The Orwellian-sounding name is of course intentional to remind us of the full range of ways in which such a system could be applied." So the word freedom tags is very much ironic. So is this in fact Bostrom's preferred solution? Does Bostrom want this to happen? Well, I started to gather up like a lot of quotes from Bostrom that I felt showed rather unambiguously that Bostrom really would not like this to happen. But I'm not really sure that like if you can read this vulnerable world hypothesis and come away with this thinking that yes, Bostrom thinks this is a great idea, then I don't think really that me finding some quotes will help to convince anyone. Another thing thought experiment that Bostrom is working with is if someone is creating a technology that would cause extinction, would it be an idea to make a preemptive attack on a sovereign nation to avoid extinction? And he says in some cases it might be. The problem with this is that if there are autocrats or aspiring autocrats, then they could use these kind of justifications for to subvert democracy, basically. And in this way, the speculation that Bostrom have these thought experiments could indirectly cause the thing that they are worried about, because they provide roadmaps and things like that. The authors don't use the word info hazard, like Bostrom obviously is, like he literally wrote the book on info hazards. That's a term coined by Nick Bostrom. So I would expect him to have thought about this. But I think we can point out some positive and negative things about this. Like, one thing we can say about this is that the first paper on what to do if we are in a vulnerable world hypothesis is written by Nick Bostrom, who is clearly not an autocrat. He would clearly not prefer that we are under pervasive surveillance and things like that. So in that way, it kind of frames the discussion. If the first paper say this is really a horrible idea, that makes it harder to later say we need to do this, compared to if the first paper was written by someone who believed autocracy was a really good idea. Also, I feel a lot of these are interesting when argued for from a existential risk perspective, but for an autocrat, I would expect these arguments to actually be rather simple to invent. Like, I would not believe that Vladimir Putin or someone would have a hard time arguing that we need more preventative policing in order to stop dangerous technology and things like that. But it's not so much clear to me. Like, the authors are talking about, like, can autocrats do this? And I think a more interesting angle would be to look more at like cultural things, like politics. Can people be convinced to accept extreme preventative policing? And one example I found is Warhammer 40K. That's an example of something that has way more cultural appeal than Bostrom's paper. And that's a world where fascism is indeed technically correct. In that, if, like, when you do world building, you can make any world, and the authors have decided to make a world where if you are not a fascist, then demons come out from chaos and eat you and everybody around you if you are not fascist. So that's why the humans in Warhammer 40K are basically fascists, and this has way more cultural appeal, and it's also not really an argument for fascism, and everybody recognizes this. And I think my point here is that Bostrom's paper, The Vulnerable World Hypothesis, has extremely less cultural impact than Warhammer 40K. So I would expect that the impact from this would be dramatically smaller. And if it's already a small impact from there, then it must be a small impact. Let's go to the idea that gives this paper the title, Democratizing Risk. Democracy must be central to efforts to prevent and mitigate catastrophic risks. In particular, choosing which risk we want to take should be a democratic endeavor. And the problem with this, I think it sounds really nice in theory. The problem is, in practice, the AGI development that is being done is, in fact, as far as I can tell, reasonably well democratically founded, in that most people believe this is the right thing to do. There is no political and democratic opposition to the work being done by DeepMind right now. It is argued that avoiding extinction is a communal project, and I think it ought to be a communal project, but we need to do something if it turns out in practice most people don't actually care. So right now, AI risk isn't that much of a communal project, unfortunately, and we need to grapple with this fact in some way. Another undemocratic problem is that some views are explicitly excluded right now, and the argument to do that needs to be compelling. So the argument in practice that is being excluded, in particular from if you want to do something like the long reflection, is the arguments for extinction, and in particular for quick extinction. And I believe that it is right and proper to exclude these views. I believe that they are sufficiently niche, but I recognize that we need some kind of like this is easily a slippery slope that I say, oh, obviously this can be excluded because it's so niche. Like some kind of way of operationalizing that would probably be better. I think it's really compelling right now at this stage because very few people are in favor of extinction right now. There's also an argument being made that democratic judgment is superior. I agree that democratic judgment is superior, but I also think that democratic judgment is not always superior, and it depends on the case. And the argument that is being presented here is insufficient in order to prove that it is in fact superior judgment we should expect from democracy. Like some of the arguments, like how there is less conflict of interests in democracies. Is that even true? I'm not entirely sure. And of course, judgment is only a part of what we need to do. A lot of this, of the facts need to be established by experts and cannot be democratically estimated or judged. Like judgment is not really about facts, and so this is a part of it, but only a part. And the explicit suggestions are citizens' assemblies, surveys, and diversifying existential risk studies. Unfortunately, there's not much more detail being given on this than what I just said. I worry that if something like citizen assemblies would be effective, then my thought would be that even smaller citizen assemblies would also be effective. Possible, that is not a given, but I think an incremental approach should work. And right now we're not really seeing that. And that is an interesting question. The obvious hypothesis is that might be because, in fact, citizen assemblies doesn't really contribute in any meaningful way to existential risk studies. But I think it's something that, in order to build an argument why this is useful, a lot more work needs to be done than just saying citizen assemblies is very easy. Actually holding a citizen assembly is a huge undertaking. And finally, how democracies limit harm. There's a claim, diverse thinkers would not sacrifice 1 billion humans for an infinitesimal improvement of our Earths. And diverse thinkers wouldn't do that, and I think basically no one would do that. It seems really unlikely. I have a hard time finding a scenario where we kill 1 billion people and then we reduce the risk of nuclear holocaust and or something like that. That doesn't really seem to be like the way the world is working. I think, in fact, there could be a core misunderstanding here in that we see a number of places in this paper that some indications that the author thinks that in the future we might in fact be placed before for options like this, where we can choose between sacrificing 1 billion people or avoiding existential risks. I think I'm strongly convinced that things that kill 1 billion people in almost always dramatically increase the risk of the existential risks. Also, scholars should in general be in favor of democratic fail-safe mechanisms, and that is indeed true. and one of the earliest work I would point to here is Elias Yudkowsky's short novel Failed Utopia number 4-2, which indeed features precisely a democratic fail-safe mechanism. How would democratic voters, well, it's claimed that they are unlikely to tolerate global catastrophic risks if they know themselves could be affected. That is a claim, and unfortunately this empirical claim seems to be untrue, right? We're right now seeing a lot of people accepting AI being developed as quickly as possible, and that is something again that the authors need to grapple with. Like the democratic structures that we have currently seem to not, in fact, put any kind of brakes on AI development. It's claimed that citizens often show a significant risk aversion in comparison to their government. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Like right now in Ukraine, we're having calls for a no-fly zone, which would be an example of citizens being way less risk-averse than the governments who are refusing calls for a no-fly zone. And it's not really, at least strongly obvious to me, that this is a facts-based difference. Governments are certainly not perfectly rational, but these kind of grassroots organizations seems not to be perfectly rational either. Empirical democratic fail-safe mechanisms seem to work. The empirical case is not as strong as well as I see it, and right now we are in a situation that looks like it's very different. Like some of the things we are seeing previously with like global warming or local pollution or whatever seems not that analogous to what we're currently facing with AI risk in particular. And so the fail-safe right now seems to not be working, and that makes it unclear whether we should double down on it if it seems to not be working. So that's the article, and now I'm going to talk a bit about the AI forum post that accompanied this. And this is claiming a number of different things. The first is that there seems to be some kind of conspiracy against criticism. Senior scholars told us in private any critique of central figures in effective altruism would result in an inability to secure funding. And that's clearly not what these people are saying. It's not. It's quite consistent with, like we've seen earlier, the strong claim that senior scholars in other cases also have different opinions in private than they do in public, with Nick Bostrom in particular. So these two claims are rather consistent. Now, of course, the central figures in EA happen to like read the EA forum, and some of these people with Magaskill, Nick Bigstead, Holden Kanofsky, and many others, really, you would say, these central figures in EA replied to this and said, no, we in fact strongly welcome good criticism. Aaron Gertler went into more details about this claim, how it's been presented by others, and found that the evidence is very lacking for any such kind of opinion being held. I can add my own anecdata. It's like I don't have access to the central figures in the EA at all, nor do I have access to senior scholars. But I have talked to a number of EA people who are involved but not central, and I have talked to a number of scholars who are not senior scholars. And it seems really clear to them that there is a cultural norm against being afraid of criticism for fear of missing out on funding. I think it's unlikely that the culture is the opposite at the top, but this is just my anecdotes. I don't have a strong reason to have an opinion about this. And in fact, I would argue that someone like Elon Musk could be said to be closer to this. Like there Elon Musk started OpenAI and was criticized roundly for that. Eliezer Yudkowsky and Miri in particular had very harsh words against that, and it seemed like Elon Musk after that ceased to provide substantial funding. So in that way, that seems like an example of where this dynamic could indeed be true. So while I'm not one for conspiracy theories, I am not dismissing her claims as quickly and as strongly as I think other people are. The second part of the EA forum post was that this was political. And I'm sorry to say that the authors have claimed that this has been a really emotionally draining paper, and it is clear that there has been a very substantial amount of friction if you read between the lines. Sean Haggerty is in particular is called out as one who claimed that this was like a polemic post, an article. They say they believe this is meant as an insult. And in general, that there is a high burden of proof because the paper was considered political. I think that there is substantial parts of this paper that is political, and also a lot of this that didn't have to be political. That we see things about like a criticism of neoliberalism that didn't need to be in this paper, that could have been cut off very easily. And I think it, in general, if you add this, a lot of people in EA have this kind of, it's often said in particular in rationality that politics is the mind killer. And a lot of people would object to this paper just purely on this basis. And there is a question whether this is good or bad, and whether mixing political and existential risk is a good idea. I personally tend to come down on the side that it's a bad thing to politicize. But in general, political claims will be met with substantially more resistance. And finally, it stated that EA needs to make structural adjustments in order to stay on the right side of history. I think that's like staying on the right side of history is usually a historical materialism Marxist framing, and it's also obviously to me hyperbole. In that, sure, EA is not perfect, and no one is saying that EA is perfect, but it seems clearly right now to be a force for good in the world rather than a force for bad. And finally, one of the things that were criticized in the EA forum was that it's really wide-ranging. For instance, Sean Haggerty again gave the advice as reviewer to focus on one section and compare the techno-utopian approach against alternatives. They reply in the comments that there is tension between these two things, right? That they're both saying focus on one thing and also focus on more things. They have a rather adversarial reaction to this critique, to Sean Haggerty's suggestion, saying that that is only a suggestion that's given to ensure that they do not write a critique. I think, in fact, that it is a very correct criticism that Sean Haggerty is giving here. Like, if you have a paper that is really, really wide, then it's both fair enough to say there are a lot of these places where it's just too shallow, and you should either like make the paper 10 times as long, or you should focus on something where you can go into many more details. In particular, one of the things that the authors do often is presenting an argument and saying we're not convinced by this argument, and then quickly moving on without any kind of counter arguments or any detailed treatment of this, which is necessary because otherwise the paper would just be too wide. But then they should have made the paper less wide, really. In particular, one of the things that I feel is key in this is Bostrom decides to discuss surveillance in the paper The Vulnerable World Hypothesis. Is this a good idea or not? It seems in this paper that is built up to like a really bad thing, but it ends up with very, very little concrete discussion of if this is actually a good idea. I would have liked to know more about this. When called out on this in the comments, she says, or the authors, I think it's only Carla writing in the comments, we need to stop classifying everything as info hazards. But I think, in fact, if Bosco's decision to discuss this is bad for this reason, then we need to figure out if we should discuss it, and if we should discuss it, then the framing of info hazard and the theory of info hazards is probably hard to get around. And finally, I would say some of my own personal problems that are not mentioned on this EA forum post. My first one would be on the techno-utopian approach. Approach is defined as an argument in the paper, but it seems to be more like a worldview, and this kind of mixes things up, and it's really unclear to what extent the techno-utopian approach wants to build AGI as fast as possible or as safe as possible. And this kind of thing, this kind of tension is not really made clear. There's also a really strong tendency in the first part to overstate the influence of the techno-utopian approach. There are many arguments against existential risks, and I think all of them are sufficient, or basically all of them are sufficient. So the techno-utopian approach isn't really needed at all. I announced in the beginning of this, of the first session, that I would argue in favor of the techno-utopian approach, even though I don't actually hold that, and that turned out not to really be necessary, because there are just so many other good arguments against extinction. Another thing that I would really like the papers to at least acknowledge, that there is currently a lack of public engagement. It might be indeed that the way to get public engagement would be to politicize this, but it's totally you can't say that right now there is a democratic basis for existential risk studies, because that clearly isn't right. Way too few people care about this. Another thing that I felt is the argument that a moratorium is feasible is spread over many places in this paper. I counted 5 places, and none of them really are in-depth. They're not really presenting this argument like, this is why we feel that this is in fact feasible. And also whether this is desirable. That's also something that probably needs to be, like, someone needs to make a case for a moratorium. There is which we saw the first time that there was some misquotes of Bostrom, and it seems like a clear mistrust of Nick Bostrom in particular, and plausibly other people in existential risk studies, and that might be worthwhile or not. But another thing that seems really clear from the subtext in a lot of places is that the authors don't seem convinced by AI risk at all, but way more convinced about global warming as an existential risk. And in that way, it kind of feels, I think the authors are on a difficult quest to reform existential risk studies when there are so many of the existing scholars that they don't agree with, and so much of the central parts of the existing research that they also don't agree with. That makes it really hard to make a to reform the field, unfortunately, because I feel, in fact, that in many places the authors do put their finger on things that are potential problems, but it's just this paper has too many problems to be a really good criticism of the current state of existential risk studies. That is all for today. Thank you, and see you next time.